I got to explain to you also your soul, your needs, your political desires and needs, because that is Huey's soul. When we first organized the Black Panther Party for self-defense, he would say, Bobby, he says, we're going to draw up a basic platform, just basic, that black people can read. He says, we don't want to go real elaborate with all these essays and dissertations and all this stuff, because the brother going to look at that and he say, man, I ain't got time for that. I got to go see what I can do for myself. He said, just a basic platform that the mothers who struggle hard to raise us, that the fathers who worked hard, that the young brothers in school who come out of school semi-illiterate. You say we want freedom, we want power to determine the destiny of our black community.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. In fact, in your book, you point out that the coalition is already there in the Black Panther Party itself, which is a coalition of middle classes, ex-convicts, war veterans, college graduates, and then you have these street gangs. So
gang
in a way,
members, yes.
gang members, and where the question of political education is so central. So in fact, I would like you to speak a little more about the larger global context within which these coalitions are emerging and the internationalist spirit of 1968 when the Illinois chapter was formed. So do you see the possibility, historical possibility, and the spirit of such coalition as a part and parcel of this global conjuncture in which it emerged?
Yeah. So you got this, what they will argue, the international third world revolutionary proletariat struggle. And people around the world are struggling. You have the overthrow of colonialism taking place throughout the globe, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in Asia, in China, in Cuba, in other various parts of the Middle East, and with Palestine, for example. You have all these various movements taking place. And so what the Panthers are doing are learning from them. So what they will argue is that we as African Americans are a colonized group too, within the mother country though, that we are born and raised here as citizens, but we're treated as second-class citizens, like colonized, like we've been colonized. And so how do you overthrow colonial power? Where you look to those forces around the world. So they're reading Mao in the Red Book, for example, quotation of Chairman Mao. They're studying Chinese Revolution. They're studying Algeria and what's taking place with those Africans overthrowing French colonialism. They're reading Che Guevara and John Paul Sartre. They're reading all this material, learning what's taking place in the Caribbean. They turn to Vietnamese. They're reading Ho Chi Minh. They're reading how these Vietnamese, these Asian folks over here overthrowing these colonial powers. And they're finding numerous nexuses and tendencies that they can adapt here in the United States context that will help them. So I can give you too many examples, but I use this, I'm giving you these ideas of where their politicalization is coming from, that they see themselves as part of a larger global movement, that African Americans are, that everyone around the world is having some struggle. And it's our duty to join if we want our freedom. And none of these people are marching for their freedom, right? They're taking up arms and having revolutionary struggle for their freedom in most of these places. So the irony of that is we in popular discourse, like to glorify the ways in which the Panthers have influenced the world, which they have, but they can't influence the world if the world hadn't influenced them first, which is what I'm trying to highlight. So they're reading all this. They're familiar with Ambedkar. And some of the work that he had done at his time here in New York, and the way in which we have these repositories at the Schomburg, for example, in New York, and these repositories on these, remember, they're college students. And so they're doing a lot of studying and reading. So they spend 8 hours a day doing what they call PE, political education, working out your minds. You got to know why you're doing what you're doing. Then they spend the next 8 hours of their day doing political community service, what they call putting that political theory into practice. So you think about it, you got 16 hours out of the day, 8 hours in the classroom, 8 hours serving the people, body and soul. You ain't got time to hate white people. You ain't got time to hate anybody. It's too much work to be done. So the next 8 hours, you better be eating and sleeping. Right? So they're trying to do the work. And so much of what they're studying is, of course, the Constitution, and folks here in the States doing the Black Arts movement, folks like Maya Angelou and James Baldwin, they're reading King, they're reading Malcolm X, but they're also studying the world. So they're reading all these texts, these theories from around the world. They're reading Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Nyeri. They're reading Chairman Mao and Che Guevara. They're reading everyone and studying everyone and pulling these tendencies. And then they adopted and form these coalitions, form these organizational structures, survival programs, discipline, and then people began to emulate them afterwards. But they're first influenced by the internet, what they call the International Third World Revolutionary Proletariat Struggle. And that influence upon them leads them, as they will argue, the vanguard of this national movement, because the greatest threat to everyone's freedom, they will argue, was the United States. And here we are in the belly of the beast. We need to do our part to help our fellow revolutionaries and people of oppressed people around the world by taking on the state from within the state, the United States, that is. And then people around the world begin to emulate them. So ironically, the Panthers are established in Oakland in 1966 by two law students, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. They began to evolve. So at the height of the Panthers, they have 51 chapters across the United States. Now, the first chapter of the Black Panther Party is not established until much later in 1967. But the British Black Panther Party is established early in 1967. So before the Panthers can leave Oakland to start another chapter outside of Oakland, there's a copycat chapter in London, in Brixton, right? That's the kind of international influence that they have. And so, in fact, what took place was the storming of this California state legislature in May of 1967. Bobby Seale and the contingent of Panthers went to protest the state trying to pass a law to disarm them. And the governor at the time, Ronald Reagan, later future president, is there, and he witnesses these armed Panthers marching on the Capitol, the California Capitol. So those images are broadcast not just nationally, but internationally. So the people in London saw that and said, well, we need to start a Black Panther Party chapter here. They're on to something. And so they began to get the papers and copy the images and copy the photos and the iconography and so forth. But the irony of that is people in Chicago thought the same thing. Well, we need a Panther chapter here too. So that's the only reason you have one in Chicago and most of these other cities. And so that one image of the media showing these highly intelligent men reading the Constitution, reading Executive Mandate number 1, and being armed and having the courage and bravado to argue to the world that we, like other brothers and sisters around the world, are being oppressed, and they're taking off our right to defend ourselves from our oppressor. And we're not going to stand for that. And we're protesting this bill. And that image is broadcast internationally. So people that's how people are primarily introduced to the party. And then the paper begins to circulate, their newspaper. They have a publication, and that begins to circulate worldwide. And that influence, people send information to the office in Oakland, right? That's how we learn about Dalits. That's how we learn about Polynesians. That's how we learn what's taking place in Brixton, Palestinians. Folks began to send information over and have correspondence. And then the Panthers will publish that material in their newspaper about the struggles taking place in other places around the world, and vice versa. And so then people begin to travel. And then we get the establishment of the international section in Algeria once Eldridge Cleaver goes into exile, for example. So you have dignitaries all over the world coming to meet the Panthers in the capital in Algeria, in their international section, to help set up chapters in other places around the globe, primarily in the Caribbean and Africa. And most of these other folks around the world have their own issues, but they emulate the Panthers. So they're not technically official chapters of the party. They're their own entities, but they emulate various aspects. And so the Dalit Panthers, for example, are an epitome of that, established in the early 1970s, right after the international section is established in Algeria by Kathleen Cleaver and Eldridge Cleaver, for example. And so you have those kinds of influences where people actually come and meet. And you can go to Black Power conferences, International Third World Revolutionary conferences, Pan-African conferences, the Bandung conferences. Start having these global conferences that brings people together around this commonality of creating international coalitions to overthrow their oppression, their economic disparities and their social dilemmas and so forth and so on. And so the Panthers are leading in that regard. Now, most people, we argue that's Black power. That's not civil rights, because that's all about revolutionary socialism. So that's not civil rights movement. So people were protesting at the UN and things of that nature in the States. But this is about an international revolutionary movement, and that's Black power, and that's third world solidarity as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, in fact, do you see a connection between the kind of coalition emerged first within Black Panther Party and later the original Rainbow Coalition in the Illinois chapter as a part of a organizational innovation or breakthrough in this larger internationalist situation, what you described as the third world proletarian internationalism, which is anti-imperialist. So where the imagination is actually trying to move beyond the party imagination, which is a certain vanguardist imagination and which is also hegemonizing and which is in a way disintegrating towards the end of 1960, particularly in China with Mao. So do you see this coalition also as a result of this new organizational thinking?
I do, in different nuanced ways, though. So it's not a yes or no answer; it's a both and. Yeah. So, for example, the British Panther, the British Black Panther Party. So I'm writing a book about this now. I'm interested in not the places where the Panthers went, right? So they go to the Caribbean, they go to Africa, they even go to China. Right? I'm not interested in places they didn't go. They went. I'm interested in these people like in Brixton or in Mumbai and other places who had no direct connection to African Americans, let alone the Black Panther Party, and emulated them. And what they're doing is creating primarily first solidarity amongst their groups, but working in some coalitions as well. So it works quite different in India because it's a caste system, not a class issue. But let's just take Brixton, for example, the first one. The founders are Indians, right? Students who are studying at Cambridge from India. There's people from Turkey. Oh yeah, you didn't know this, huh? I'm looking at this thumbnail on your face. Oh yeah, Farag Dowdy, and I know I'm murdering his name. He's one of the original founders of the British Black Panther Party, and he's a student at Cambridge in India, for example. And most of the membership are made up from people from all over the globe. They're pretty much the colonial subjects of the British Empire. So, and I say people from everywhere. They're from the Philippines, they're from Turkey, they're from India, they're from everywhere where the British had painted their flag. And together they come together and form this coalition and call themselves the British Black Panther Party, where most of the people aren't Black. Now, the folks from the Caribbean, Jamaica, and people from Africa are Black, but most of the folks, the other folks, these are Asians, these are South Asians, these are Europeans in some ways regard. These are other Caribbean folks from the global South. These are who happen to be subjects of the British Empire. And they come together, form all of these folks from Turkey. They come together and form this coalition called the British Black Panther Party. That's very much influenced by the kind of coalition politics that the Panthers are doing in the States. It's about class solidarities. It's about racial solidarities. It's about commonality, finding the common threads that we have in common. And so that's what the Panthers were genius at. And so how do you get, for example, if we look at these binary oppositions, you have this African-American group, and you have the Young Patriots, these Confederate flag Southern white migrants, right? These groups are supposed to hate each other, right? This is the epitome of white supremacy versus Black power. And the Panthers are able to bring these groups together by finding the commonality. And what are the commonalities? They're poverty, that we're both poor, but we hate each other because of our skin color. But if we ignore our differences, I'm ignoring that racist Confederate flag, and you are ignoring my unapologetically Black bravado, hypermasculinity, and then just look at what we actually have in common. We're poor, we have no health care, we don't have education, we don't have adequate housing, we don't have jobs, we've been drafted to Vietnam to go fight in the war, we don't have dental, and the list is long, right? So we both being brutalized by the police, we both are facing oppression from the state. Why do we hate each other again? Because you're Black and I'm white? That's stupid. Let's unite on what we have in common. And so those ways of finding commonalities is the way in which the Panthers, they put that theory into practice, right? They're reading the revolutionary third world solidarity. That's what folks are doing in India. That's what folks are doing in Algeria. They're forming these kinds of coalitions and find these commonalities because you can't fight alone, right? So you need allies. So this is what turns out to be a methodology for a revolutionary struggle becomes the no-brainer. This is what we should have been doing from the start. That these issues don't just affect Black people, they affect all poor people. And not just all poor people in the States, right? It affects poor people all over the world, right? And so these issues that we can unite upon. So in Great Britain, for example, these are the colonial subject of the British Empire. Doesn't matter how you racially identify. And most of these folks are poor, trying to work through this white supremacist institution it's called the British Crown. And so they have some commonalities. In India, they're Dalits, right? They're the lords of the caste. You have some commonalities. This is something that we can actually unite upon, even though there's difference between gender dynamics and other issues, right? Hindus and Buddhists and other things, but you can come together on these issues of how the caste is oppressing these groups. So you find commonalities and folks unite on those. But the Panthers didn't create this. I don't want to, as much as I love this group, I can't romanticize. They're learning from others, right? They're reading this, they're reading Frantz Fanon. They're reading Chairman Mao, Ho Chi Minh. They're learning these things and then applying them. And then because they're so successful at it, people begin to emulate them. So most of the people around the world emulate the Panthers first and foremost because of their survival programs. Second, because of the coalitions that they create, the class and racial solidarity around this idea of overthrowing their oppression. No one around the world picks up the gun. Only two people do that. Palestinians, because they have a different kind of war taking place, Israel, Palestine, but no one is infatuated with the gun. That's very, very much an American phenomenon. To this day, we are still infatuated with the gun. That's still an egregious issue that we have in our society. But this idea of gun culture is an American one. The only other group besides Palestinians were the Australians, the Australian Black Panther Party. They wanted the gun for armed self-defense as well. And so take those two groups out. No one around the world is intrigued by the Panthers' armed self-defense methods. They like the ideology, they like the survival programs, and they're intrigued by the coalitions. And the way in which you bring people together as a group of solidarity to solve your primarily, first and foremost, your economic disparities that would then lead to solving your social disparities by using these survival programs that helps one another, and they're self-run, it's self-determination. You're not relying on the state, you're relying on each other to take care of each other in a communal way. And that's revolutionary. And so that's why folks around the world begin to emulate. That's why folks here in the States do so as well.
Absolutely. In fact, you've been talking about how, as a part of political education, the Black Panthers have been reading literature, revolutionary literature from across the world. And you mentioned Dr. Ambedkar as well. And yes. Dr. Ambedkar has been in conversation with Du Bois in the first half of the 20th century. Yeah, Du Bois, absolutely.
Marcus Garvey.
Yep. Yes. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So in your research, did you find any specific engagement with Dr. Ambedkar's thinking in late 1960s, a specific literature which was being read or a specific ideas discussed, and also reference to Dalit Panthers, because I believe that Dalit Panther was mentioned and recognized in the Black Panther literature and pamphlets, journals. So could you throw light upon these connections?
So it was the Dalit Panthers who actually introduced the Black Panther Party to Ambedkar. So here in the States, we romanticize Mahatma Gandhi because of Martin Luther King. Yes. And it was the Dalit Panthers who set African Americans in general, but particularly Black Panther Party, we talked about them, set us straight on the racism and discrimination of Gandhi and the revolutionary and more critical thinking of folks we had not been familiar with of Ambedkar, who actually spent time here. And so that's where the exchanges come, of information. And so it was the Dalit Panthers who actually introduced much of our, I shouldn't say at least the Black Panther Party, but you had others as well, Indian immigrants who had introduced African Americans throughout the period, especially during the communist era in the 1950s and others, to Ambedkar as opposed to Gandhi. So when the Civil Rights movement really kicked off, that's when these exchange of political changes between African Americans and South Asians began to take fold, because King invoked Gandhi religiously. And so who is Gandhi? We want to know. And then you had this anti-apartheid movement taking place in South Africa and the work that Gandhi is doing. So we're studying Gandhi. And then it's not until other South Asians well, we would say, why you hating on Gandhi? What's wrong with y'all? Well, no, you don't know some of his real ideology and color dynamics in terms of how he thinks about people who look like you. You should be reading folks, if you're a Dalit, you should be reading folks who like Ambedkar. Now, if you're not a Dalit, nobody's talking about Ambedkar. It's only the Dalits who are talking about Ambedkar. It's not all South Asians. And then so we have to learn the difference between class and caste. And once we understood the caste system and the ways in which Ambedkar's philosophy fit like a glove with what we're doing, it made sense. And so folks began as political PE courses to study, as you study the international movement, who are you all studying? And folks kept evoking Ambedkar. Then you start to, these light bulbs started to go off when you realize that he spent time talking to these dignitaries that we respect, like Du Bois and Garvey and others, and the kind of influence he had upon some of their work. And these folks spend time learning from these folks, and spend time in Colombia, spend time in the Black community. He has papers and material in our largest archive at the Schomburg, like, well, he's one of us, right? And so it changes the dynamic in that regard. But before that, it was all about Gandhi until we were educated. And some of that comes, we will argue, that's also Black power. Before, during this period, it's Gandhi who we learn about. That's civil rights. Then Ambedkar comes along, that's Black power. It's a whole different philosophy, a whole different ideology. And so we're studying someone totally different, and we oppose Gandhi because we now understand his politics and his racial problems, his problems with race. But there's tactics that you still pull out, right? So you still got to give Gandhi credit for his influence upon our greatest dignitary to date, which is Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and the way in which he appropriated a lot of Gandhi's philosophy and tactics to give us various forms of freedom and revolutionize society in a way. So we can't wholly dismiss him, but he's problematic for a whole host of ways. So if you really want freedom, you really want revolutionary freedom, you should be reading Ambedkar. And so we have all these African-American scholars writing books about Ambedkar and studying Ambedkar, teaching about Ambedkar, especially in law. So here at my institution, for example, Kevin Brown has been teaching and writing about Ambedkar for like 20 plus years, and introducing us and others to the ways in which African Americans need to think about their struggle by studying some of the writings and philosophy and ideologies of Ambedkar. And so every time we go to India, I mean, we advocate on behalf of the Dalit struggle, meeting Dalits, meeting Dalit Panthers, having conferences. And we spend most of our time studying Ambedkar. So that's what we do. And there's a lot of commonality there. And again, caste versus class, but we still have a lot of overlap and coalitions that could be there. So much of the work that I do and have done, some of which with Kevin Brown and others, is when we are working with Dalits in our current context, folks are intrigued about Obama when Obama was president. That African Americans must have overcome something that we have an African American president. And so let's figure out what those things are and those commonalities and those struggles so we can apply them to the caste issue here in India. Before Mahendra Modi got elected, it was a little bit more easy to have these conversations, but getting more, this oppression has gotten more stringent. And so we're happy to come over there and let folks know what we just got a Black president. Ain't nothing changed. It's gotten worse. Black Lives Matter started under Obama. It wasn't there before Obama. This is a backshoot. We got Trump because of Obama. So we got a long way to go. Actually, we went 5 steps backwards as a result of Obama's election, because he was just so dynamic that white supremacy just wouldn't let those strands go. They actually turned up the fire and the reins. And so, and we will argue, which I do in my teachings, that same thing happened in India with Mahendra Modi, right? When Dalits began to make certain progressions, now we got this oppressive guy. I want to be hesitant, not call him Trump, but there's a lot of extremism on his end that I disagree with. So in my neighborhood here, I shouldn't mention all these personal things. So I live around a lot of my neighbors are South Asians, and so we fight over this Hindu nationalism idea all the time, because of course they're not Dalits. So at least they don't claim to be. So they're always surprised that I know a lot about Indian politics, or the caste system, or even surprised that I've been to India more times than they have been in their lifetimes, and can have these kind of debates. And I'm always on the other side of the argument, where so now my wife is forcing me not to talk about politics because I'm losing friends because they love Modi. And I'm like, you love an oppressor. And so we have these knockdown, drag out fights. So both sides, on both sides of me, my neighbors are South Asian. And these are some of my closest buddies, but till these conversations come up, then we don't see eye to eye. We won't, and I don't back down, but I try to be respectful because, it's their country. So I try to be transparent, whatever you're trying to tell me about the African-American struggle and what we should be doing. So I get what you're saying, but you support an oppressor. That's like me saying black folks should support Trump. Now, come on, man, relax. I don't agree with this. This kind of nationalism has oppressive tendencies, and you have machete atrocities taking place on the ways in which atrocities and violence is arisen under him, and you don't oppose this, so you think this is okay. And so we have these knockdown, drag out fights over it, and we don't have enough beer exchanges as we used to anymore as a result. But I have to, and when I have these fights, I'm citing Ambedkar. We're talking about Ambedkar, and some of these, I almost called them out their names. I'm about to say some of these bastards, they never even heard of Ambedkar, right? So these are some of the why we're having these fights. So that just demonstrates why you have some of the tendencies and ideologies that you have. You might want to read some of this material. And then I do when they take offense because it's advocating on behalf of Dalits. And then that's a whole nother conversation. So you have you got an anti-Dalit movement right here in red states like Indiana, for example. So we have, I don't have to go all the way to India to have this fight, is what I'm trying to say. I can have it right here on my block with my neighbors. And so the struggle continues for us both.